I will never forget the day I had to go down to the basement. It was an old house that I inherited after my uncle died. He was always a little strange, lived a hermit life, and we hardly talked. When I found out he left me this house, I thought it would be a good investment to sell it and make some money. But everything changed when I first saw the basement. I was not prepared for what I would see there. As soon as I opened the heavy wooden door, I was immediately hit by the smell. It was a suffocating smell of dampness, mixed with something I couldn't place, but it definitely disgusted me. The stairs creaked under my feet as I started down. The flashlight barely illuminated the old brick walls, which were covered with mold. But that's not what bothered me the most. I felt a chill that penetrated my bones. It wasn't just a lack of heat, it was a different, more eerie cold. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Something was wrong with this place. My fingers were shaking as I shined the light on the wall and saw something that made me stop. Strange symbols were carved on the wall. They looked old, like they had been carved a long time ago, but what were they doing here? Who did it? At that moment I started to hear sounds. They were soft, almost indistinct whispering voices coming from the depths of the basement. They were so soft that I couldn't understand a single word, but their tone was ominous. I wanted to turn back, run out of this damned place, but something kept me going. My feet stomped heavily on the cold concrete floor, each step echoing with a dull thud against the basement walls. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old house making the usual creaks and noises, but deep inside I knew it wasn't. The sounds grew louder and they were definitely getting closer. It was as if someone or something moving in the shadows was trying to whisper something important to me, something I wasn't meant to hear. My flashlight illuminated the old wooden shelves that stood along the walls, filled with dust and cobwebs. On them lay boxes, books, well hidden under a thick layer of dust, and other items that seemed untouched for years. But then I noticed something else: newer tracks. On the floor, among the dust, there were clearly visible shoe prints leading further into the darkness of the basement. Cold sweat covered my forehead as I realized I wasn't alone. Who else was in that basement? And why did they try to remain invisible? Hundreds of questions swarmed in my head, but none of the answers came, only deaf fear and growing panic. The tracks led to an old metal door that I hadn't noticed before. They were covered in rust, but they looked extremely strong. The whispers started again. Now they were right outside the door. I moved closer, trying to hear better, but as soon as my hand touched the cold metal, the whispering stopped abruptly, as if someone or something realized I was here. I froze, unable to take the next step. A silence hung in the air, so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I was about to retreat when I suddenly heard a soft knock at the door. Someone was there and he was trying to get my attention. The knocking on the door continued, becoming louder and more insistent. I stood paralyzed with fear, not knowing what to do next. It seemed like my every instinct was screaming to run, but something in me still compelled me to stay, to explore what was behind that damned door. The hand itself reached for the old, cold handle. It was slippery with rust, but I, holding my breath, still dared to return it. The door creaked open, and behind it I was greeted by near total darkness, with only my flashlight illuminating a small patch of space in front of me. A narrow corridor leading deep into the basement opened before me. The walls were damp and covered with fungus, and there were pools of standing water on the floor. I took a few steps forward, trying to figure out where this tunnel would lead. The whispering sounds started again, closer and clearer now, but they seemed to come from all directions at the same time. It was like a chorus of voices whispering something I couldn't understand, but each whisper seemed charged with hatred and pain. I was walking further down the tunnel and suddenly I noticed something on the floor. It was an old pocket watch. I bent down and picked it up, and when I opened it, I saw that it had stopped at exactly 3:15 in the morning. The stopwatch didn't work, but there was a small piece of paper inside the watch. I unfolded it and saw a short message written in illegible handwriting: "Do not go any further." A chill ran down my spine. The watch looked like something that might have belonged to my uncle, but I wasn't sure. Maybe this was his way of warning me? Is it just a coincidence? I was standing still, staring at the clock, when I heard another sound. It was a soft sob, somewhere ahead, from the end of the tunnel. I knew I should have turned around and walked away, but I couldn't. Something, maybe some part of me, wanted to know what was at the other end of this cursed place. I decided to move on. With each step I felt fear pulling me deeper into its grip. The sobbing was getting louder and louder, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. It came straight from the end of the tunnel, where my flashlight barely illuminated the dark horizon. Thoughts swirled in my head. Who could it be? Why is he or she crying? And why here in this ominous basement? I kept moving forward even though my every instinct was screaming to stop. As I neared the end of the tunnel, I began to see more clearly the outline of a small room illuminated by a faint light. It was an old, shabby utility room lined with boxes and old furniture. The heavy smell of mold and damp was even stronger here than in the rest of the basement. In the center of the room, sitting on the cold floor, was a figure. She was wrapped in an old blanket, her head was bent to her knees, and the sobbing sounds were coming from her. I froze in place, unable to believe my eyes. It was a man whose face was hidden by long, unkempt hair that hung down in front of him. His shoulders were shaking from crying and he didn't seem to notice my approach. I didn't know what to say, but I felt I had to try. Are you okay? My words sounded hoarse as if the voice did not belong to me. The crying suddenly stopped and the man slowly raised his head. His face was as pale as a ghost, and his eyes. Those eyes were completely black without any hint of whites or pupils. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it pounding in my chest. The man was looking straight at me, and his mouth began to slowly stretch into a creepy, unnatural smile. He raised his hand and pointed to something behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but my curiosity and fear made me do it. I turned my head and saw something that made me take a few steps back. A large photograph hung on the wall. It showed my uncle standing with the same man who was now in front of me. But in the photo, this man looked completely different, young, healthy, and his eyes were the usual color. They were standing in front of the same house I was in now. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end as I realized that this man was the same man standing before me. But how is this possible? What happened to him? And why is he here in this basement with black eyes and a creepy smile? I took a few steps back, trying to figure out what was going on. The man continued to stare at me, his grin widening, revealing a row of rotten teeth. My thoughts raced wildly. This is just some terrible dream, a nightmare from which I am about to wake up. But every beat of my heart reminded me that this is all reality. Suddenly, the man began to slowly rise from the floor. His movements were uneven, as if his body wasn't quite obeying. I could see his bony hands shaking as he rose to his feet. I was about to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. He took a step forward, his black eyes never leaving mine. I felt panic rising inside me, and the only thing I could do was retreat further into the corner of the room. He was coming slowly but surely. My feet hit something hard and I almost fell. Looking around, I saw an old wooden box closed with a heavy lock. Some inner voice told me that the answer to what was happening was hidden there. But there was no time to think, the man was already almost there. I grabbed the flashlight and without thinking threw it in the stranger's direction. The flashlight hit him, but instead of stopping, he just wobbled and continued moving towards me as if he hadn't felt the impact at all. My head closed, I could no longer stand still. I rushed to the box, trying to find a way to open the lock. My hands were shaking, but luckily I had an old rusty crowbar nearby. I grabbed her and started hitting the lock with all my might. The man was already a few feet away from me when the lock finally gave way and opened. I quickly threw back the lid of the drawer and saw something I will never forget. Inside were old, yellowed photos and documents, but most importantly, a small box covered in black leather. She looked important, as if she was hiding something extremely valuable. I instinctively reached for her, but as soon as I took her in my arms, the man froze. He stopped moving, his black eyes fixed on the box I was holding. His smile slowly faded, and then he began to back away slowly, as if the thing was unbearably disgusting to him. Something in that box mattered, and it was the only thing keeping him at a distance from me. But I knew it wasn't the end. The tunnel, the basement, the whole place held even more secrets, and I was on the verge of something incredibly scary. The man continued to back away, his eyes fixed on the black box in my hands. His demeanor changed. Instead of chasing me, he looked confused and even a little scared. My mind tried to piece together all the pieces of what was happening, but the answers were just out of reach. I held the box tightly, feeling that it was what was keeping me from imminent danger. Whatever was inside had tremendous power over that man. But instead of easing the situation, it only increased my fear. What could be so terrible in that box that made him retreat? The man stopped at the threshold of the tunnel, and then slowly, almost reluctantly, turned and began to walk back into the darkness. His figure gradually disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel, but his presence remained like a heavy shadow that hung in the air. I was left alone in the room, breathing often and intermittently. My heart was pounding in my chest and my hands were shaking as I decided to open the box. It looked old and worn, but despite that it was tightly closed. I looked around for some kind of mechanism or lock but found nothing. It had no visible way of opening, but I felt that it should open. I ran my fingers over its surface, looking for some clue, and suddenly I heard a soft click. The box seemed to dissolve itself in my hands. Inside was a small metal key and an old, tattered piece of paper. I unfolded it and saw a few words written in the same illegible handwriting as the note in the watch. "Don't use the key if you want to live." These words penetrated me like needles of ice. I clutched that key in my hands, knowing that it probably opened something very dangerous. But what exactly? And is it worth the risk? My thoughts were racing, but I knew I couldn't leave it like that. Something in this house, in this basement, has already begun to haunt me. And if I don't find an answer, it will continue. I turned back to the tunnel. The man was no longer visible, but I felt his presence somewhere in the darkness. The only thing left to do is to find what unlocks this key and finally understand what horrors lurk in this cursed place. I stood at the threshold of a dark tunnel, clutching a metal key in my hands. My head was spinning with thoughts and guesses, but my heart told me one thing: I must find the castle it goes to. Not knowing what lay ahead, I took a deep breath and set off into the darkness. The tunnel was getting narrower and narrower, the walls were covered with black, slimy mold and stagnant water spread underfoot. The cold pierced me to the bones, and every step echoed like a loud echo in this claustrophobic space. I tried not to think about what might have happened if I had stayed in that room, but I could still feel the gaze of that dark figure that had just retreated into the shadows. The tunnel led me to another metal door, even older and rustier than the previous one. But this door was special. They were jammed with chains that someone had fastened securely, as if trying to hold something inside. My heart beat faster in my chest when I realized that this key must be for this particular door. I looked at the door and then at the key in my hand. The words on the note echoed in my head again: "Don't use the key if you want to live." I hesitated. Something inside me was screaming not to do this, to go back, to leave this place forever. But something else, perhaps my stubbornness or a terrible need to understand what was happening, pushed me forward. My hands were shaking as I inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, like it was made just for this. With a loud click, the lock gave way and the chains fell to the floor with a thud. My nerves were on edge, but I knew there was no going back. I pulled the heavy handle and the door slowly opened. Behind them opened a room illuminated by a dim red light. The air here had a heavy, rich metallic smell that made my head spin. I took a step forward and my gaze was met by something that made me freeze in place. In the middle of the room stood a large, black stone altar covered with some strange symbols. On it were various objects, old candles, metal bowls, and what looked like ancient instruments of torture. But the thing that scared me the most was the object that hung directly above the altar. It was a rope coming down from the ceiling with a noose at the end that swayed as if someone had just used it. Old photographs were hung on the walls. I looked closely and realized that they all depicted different people, but they all had one thing in common. Each of them had the same black eyes as the man I met in the tunnel. I could feel a cold sweat covering my body. What was that place? And what happened to these people? Suddenly the room was filled with the same whispers that had been haunting me all this time. It was louder, almost unbearable, and it sounded like thousands of voices trying to say something at once. My consciousness began to tear into pieces from the tension, when I suddenly realized that this place was intended for rituals, and these rituals were far from innocent. Something dark and sinister lurked in this basement. And now that I had opened that door, I felt that I could no longer stop what had been started. The whispers began to grow, filling the room, becoming a chaotic hum that seemed to penetrate right into my brain. I felt every word, every sound make me tremble with fear. It was more than just sounds, it was a sense of the presence of something invisible but incredibly powerful. I stood motionless, as if my feet were glued to the floor, looking at the rope that swung above the altar. Her movements were strangely mesmerizing, as if she were inviting me to come closer. But I knew it was a trap. Something in this room was extremely dangerous and I had to avoid any contact at all costs. The whisper merged into one endless note that sounded in my head. I could barely think, but somehow I managed to concentrate and began to look around the room. My eyes fell on one of the pictures on the wall. It showed my uncle with the same man with black eyes standing next to him. They were holding what looked like the same black box I found. I turned sharply to the altar, trying to understand what exactly was happening here. Something told me that this box and the key were only part of a bigger picture that I could not yet fathom. But intuition told me that I was getting closer to the solution. Taking a few more steps forward, I saw that in one of the corners of the room was another box similar to the one I was holding. It was old, covered in dust, and it looked like no one had opened it for years. But something about her made me come closer. My hands were shaking as I picked it up and began to examine it. The same symbols as those on the altar were engraved on its lid. The feeling of something pushing me to open it became almost unbearable. But I was already unable to stop. I was burning with the desire to understand what this place hides. I slowly lifted the lid of the box and it opened with a slight click. Inside was another key, but it was much larger and heavier than the previous one. Next to it was another note, written in the same handwriting. This key will open the door behind which lies the truth. But remember, the truth always has a price. My fingers ran nervously over the note and I felt a chill run down my spine. I no longer had any illusions about what was waiting for me next. This basement, these rituals, and all the sinister things that happened here were only the tip of the iceberg. Whatever was behind that door could be the end of me, or the discovery of the most terrifying secret of my life. With a heavy heart, I took the key and moved on, looking for a door he could open. The tunnel led me to another corridor, even darker and more humid than the previous one. With each step I felt the pressure and fear growing, but I could not stop. My curiosity and fear of the unknown kept me going, despite the voice inside that begged me to stop. The corridor ended with another door, massive, tattered, with a large antique lock. My heart beat faster when I realized that this key was perfect for them. I stood before them, feeling every cell in my body quiver with tension. I inserted the key into the lock and, holding my breath, turned it. The door slowly opened, creaking like in the worst horror movies. Behind them I saw a dark space, but from that place came a sound that made my heart freeze again. It was the same whine I had heard before, but now it was louder and more hollow, as if it were coming from the very heart of this damned basement. I took a step forward and realized that there was no going back now. Now I had entered something much bigger and scarier than I could have imagined. And the only way out was to go through everything to the end. I stepped into the darkness, feeling the air grow thicker and colder. My every step echoed in the void that absorbed the sound, making it muffled and unsettling. I could barely see anything in front of me, but I could feel the space growing larger, expanding into an unnatural void. The darkness around me was so dense that it seemed to envelop me, making me feel small and defenseless. I listened to a sobbing sound coming from somewhere ahead. It grew louder and more noticeable, making me stop and look around each time it increased. My heart was pounding as if it was trying to escape from my chest. The fear that gripped me from all sides was turning into something physical, like cold ice squeezing my throat. Suddenly I heard another sound, heavy footsteps echoing in the darkness. They came closer to me with each heartbeat. The feeling that someone or something was chasing me was so strong that I considered for a moment whether I should stop and try to escape. But another part of me knew that running away would be futile. This place was too sinister, too insidious, to let anyone just leave like that. I continued to move forward, feeling fear and terror intertwine inside of me. Finally, I stepped out into a great hall lit only by dim lanterns hanging from the walls. The room was so large that the light did not reach its ends, plunging everything into thick darkness. In the center of the hall stood a large stone structure, similar to an altar, but even larger and more threatening. In the center of this altar, on a large carved pillar, was tied what at first glance looked like a human figure. I approached, barely breathing, and saw that it was a woman, her face contorted with terror and pain. Her eyes were wide open, but there was nothing human inside them, only empty darkness, the same as everything around her. She was alive, but she looked like she was on the verge of death. Her hands were firmly tied to the post, and around her body were placed some strange, carved bracelets that looked like ancient artifacts. She sobbed and moaned as if she was in unspeakable pain, but she could not escape. That sound I heard all this time was her crying. I felt an unbearable desire to help her, to free her from this horror, but at the same time I understood that it was not so simple. Something in her gaze, in those empty eyes, made me stop and step back. This woman was no longer herself. She had become part of this sinister ritual that was consuming her soul, turning her into something unclean. As I stood mesmerized by this eerie scene, I heard a low but distinct whisper coming from right behind me. I turned and my heart stopped as a shadow stood behind me, tall and invisible in the darkness, but I could clearly see its outline. She looked like a human, but her features were blurred, as if she had been created out of darkness itself. That shadow was closing in on me slowly but inexorably, and I felt a cold sweat run down my skin. A sense of impending doom washed over me, but I couldn't move. I was as if paralyzed by this horror, unable to take a single step. The shadow stopped a few paces away from me, and I heard its voice, deep, hollow, like the rumble of thunder coming from the depths of the earth. You showed up where you shouldn't be. And now you're part of this place. Your journey is complete and no one is coming back from here. I felt the ground beneath my feet shake and the shadow began to engulf me as it did everything else in this room. My consciousness began to dissolve into the darkness, and the last thing I heard was the same whimpering cry that grew louder and louder until I disappeared into the impenetrable darkness, becoming a part of this cursed place. Darkness enveloped me on all sides and I lost all sense of time and space. It felt like I was in a bottomless well where nothing mattered. A cold horror engulfed me, but at the same time, something made me struggle, pushing back against this darkness that sought to destroy me. It was like an inner feeling that kept me from giving up. My legs, though heavy, began to move forward, pushing through the darkness that surrounded me from all sides. Each step was taken with an incredible effort, but I could not stop. I knew that if I stayed where I was, this shadow would consume me forever. I had to find a way out. Suddenly the darkness began to dissipate, and I saw a faint glimmer of light in front of me. He was distant, almost invisible, but there was some hope in him. I moved closer to him, feeling my heart begin to beat faster, and now the sound of sobbing receded as if I was leaving him behind. A glimmer of light led me to a door, an old, tattered one that looked as if it had survived centuries of oblivion. I moved closer, feeling the air grow thicker, as if something warned me that an even greater horror lay behind this door. But I had no choice. I knew I had to continue the journey to find the answer. I slowly opened the door and another tunnel opened up in front of me. But this one was completely different from the one I came here for. It was lit by a dim red light coming from walls covered in strange symbols. The symbols looked ancient, as if they had been carved in prehistoric times, and they radiated an unpleasant warmth that seeped into my bones. The tunnel led down, deeper underground. I was about to move forward when I heard a familiar sound. It wasn't a whimper but something else, a soft thump, like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere deep in the tunnel. The sound was so hypnotic that I couldn't help but go for it. He pulled me forward like a magnet, forcing me to forget about everything else. I went deeper and deeper and the tunnel began to change. The ceiling got lower and lower and the walls got narrower until I felt I could only get through by bending over. But the sound of the beating heart grew louder and louder, and it was the only guide in this maze. Finally, the tunnel led me to a small stone room that looked like a tomb. In the center was a large black stone, and on top of it was a tiny wooden box that looked like a coffin. The same thud came from the cracks in the box, and I felt a cold sweat run down my back with fear. I came closer to the box and I felt the ground under my feet tremble slightly. I couldn't help myself, my hand reached for the lid by itself. I had to know what was inside. Breathing heavily, I lifted the lid. Inside, on a dark velvet pillow, lay something that made my heart freeze. It was a human heart, but not just any ordinary heart. It was black as if burned and still beating like it was alive. Each of his punches echoed in my head, making the world around me spin. I felt terror wash over me. This heart was alive, but there was nothing human in it. It was part of this place, this cursed basement, and now it knew of my presence. I took a step back, feeling panic begin to take over. But before I could take another step, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. From the darkness that surrounded me, the same voice that I heard before appeared, and it spoke only one word: "Give it back." The word was spoken with such force and authority that I felt my hand reach back to the box of its own accord. But I fought the feeling, trying to stay in control. Something in me told me that if I obeyed, I would lose myself forever. I felt a cold wind blow from the tunnel, as if the darkness itself was rising to consume me. But I snapped out of that trance and rushed back into the tunnel, leaving behind me that creepy box and everything in it. I ran without looking back, feeling the darkness catch up to me, trying to swallow me. But I ran as hard as I could, listening only to my pulse echoing in my ears. I knew if I stopped it would be the end. Finally, I saw the light ahead, a way out of this horrible place. I rushed to him, feeling the last strength leaving me. And when I finally reached the exit, emerging to the surface, I heard this voice for the last time coming from the darkness. "You'll be back." I ran outside, blinded by the bright daylight, but the sense of security was short-lived. The light amazed me, but I knew I could never forget what I had left behind in the darkness. I panicked and started running, not knowing where I was going, just trying to leave everything behind. Every step felt heavy, like I was carrying the weight of everyone I saw in the basement. I wandered the streets, feeling nothing but the chilling terror that forged me from within. A world that had seemed ordinary before now seemed so unreachable and helpless. I felt that no one could understand what had happened, and I was left with this terrible secret alone. After a few hours of wandering, I finally made it home. The familiar space and sounds promised peace, but I knew it was just an illusion. As soon as I closed the door, an indescribable anxiety came over me again. I kept looking around, afraid that the darkness might become physical, trapping me in this safe space. I tried to occupy myself with something, watching TV, reading, cooking, but it was all pointless. My mind was filled with images from the basement. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, that those I saw would never leave me alone. That night I tried to sleep, but without success. I lay in bed, listening to the sounds around me, the rustling of trees in the wind, the distant roar of cars, even the sounds of night birds, all of which reminded me of what I had experienced. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself down, but with each passing moment, the fear became greater. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling like I was being watched. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow in the darkness of the room. She stood in the corner, motionless, as if waiting for something. I tried to scream, but my voice got stuck in my throat. It seemed that the whole world froze with me. The shadow slowly approached, and I felt something cold and horrible fill the room. I grabbed the phone, trying to call someone, but I didn't even have time to press the button. She got closer, and I realized that it was no longer just a shadow. It was the same silhouette that haunted me in the basement. "You're back," said the voice I dreaded, and my heart pounded in terror. I jumped out of bed, losing all sense of reality. I couldn't afford to stop. I threw open the door with all my strength and ran down the corridor, passing everything familiar. My thoughts were running wild, trying to find a way out, trying to forget what had happened. But deep down I knew I couldn't escape. I rushed outside into the darkness, where the cold wind hit my face. I didn't know where to go, only that I needed to be as far away from that place as possible. As I wandered through the dark streets, I heard the same sound again, a faint but unbearable knock that sounded so familiar. Feeling my heart racing again, I returned to the same part of town where I first came across that basement. I stopped, watching the old, familiar door. They were closed, but I could feel them calling me inside. I became part of that circle again, not knowing if I would ever be able to get out. But the question arose before me, is this really the end or just the beginning of a new horror? I knew I had to make a decision, either go back to what was waiting for me or break out of this damn circle, but could I? I stood still, feeling the battle raging inside me. Those doors that I was so afraid of, and at the same time so longed to open, beckoned to me again. They were a symbol of everything I had been through, of all the horror I was trying to cope with. I realized that my fear had not gone away, and the more I tried to avoid it, the more it pressed on me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down, but it didn't help. My pulse was pounding in my temples, and my legs were as if chained to a place. There was some invisible force that made me go back. I took a step forward, then another, and suddenly I was in front of the door. I felt that I was no longer just a visitor but a part of this story. I put my hand on the cold surface of the door and felt it pulsate as if waiting for me. Could I really get in there again? What else could be waiting for me there? Finally, I gathered all my will and opened the door. The darkness came over me again and I felt the fear return. But now I knew I couldn't back down. I had to find answers. Inside the basement, everything looked the same as before. Darkness surrounded me, but I could hear the same strange sounds still echoing in the depths. I started walking, feeling every step remind me of what I had been through. But I had a goal. I searched for answers. I reached the same tunnel where I first heard that terrible knocking. Now it sounded louder, as if they were calling me. I began to walk towards him, following this call that filled me with fear and a desire to learn more. When I reached the room where I had seen the black box before, I had the feeling that I was not alone. A presence surrounded me and I looked around for signs of life. But everything was quiet, only the same heart that beat in the box echoed in the silence. Images began to appear from the depths of the tunnel, vague silhouettes that resembled people who once existed here. They moved but did not touch me. I realized that they were a part of this place, victims just like me. They were whispering about something about the secrets of this basement, and I couldn't understand what they wanted. I went to the box and, despite all my caution, opened it again. Inside lay the same black heart as before, but now it looked more alive, as if it had become a part of that darkness. I could feel it calling to me, but I knew I couldn't obey. "I'm not coming back," I whispered quietly, and suddenly everything around me changed. Images began to take shape, and I saw despair in their faces. These were people who couldn't escape, and now they stayed here forever. I could not stand any longer. My consciousness began to become feverish, and I felt the darkness fill me from within. I went back to the exit, but the tunnel seemed endless. I ran, feeling nothing but fear haunting me. Finally, I broke into the light. But this light was different, bright and dazzling. I found myself in the same place where I first entered the basement, and heard a familiar voice coming from the darkness. "You can't escape." I realized that I was now part of that circle and had no choice. I had to find a way to escape this horror before it was too late. But how?